be used like a mariner. So to define the shipboard user requirements, it's best to leave this to the organization that can best do it. And this was IMO, and NAV 53 said, we need to define user requirements. Germany last year conducted an international study, reported at NAV 54 on the outcome. Norway, using the same basic questionnaire form, did a similar study and has recently reported this to the e-navigation correspondence group. Canada did a comprehensive study, both of shipborne users and shore-based providers, including a variety of interviews and questionnaire sessions. They too have just submitted their report to the IMO correspondence group. In concept, then, we should be taking a similar approach to shore-based. In this particular case, and there was a long session yesterday that went through in great detail what BTS is now and what it will become in the future, thanks to Peter Pat and Case Polderman and all. Information service, traffic organization service, navigation assistance service, and supporting services. Now, as a former mariner, I'm saying, all sounds pretty good, but what are the differences? And how will these be provided? If you then take the shipborne information tasks, you can use these to identify what are, in fact, the maritime information needs. And in some respects, this is, again, was done by IMO. And listed there are 7. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean these are the only 7, but these are certainly reporting important tasks. Route planning, grounding avoidance, route execution, key tasks for any mariner in the practice of prudent seamanship. But on the other hand, if we're talking about equipment, systems, and services, what are they? Or what will they be? Again, it can't be everything. And what systems need not be included? And at this conference and other conferences, there's usually great interest and zeal by saying anything is possible. Well, I would argue that coming up with new and good ideas is easy. Eliminating the bad ones is difficult. And not every idea is necessarily going to be a good idea. That ought to be a new system or service as part of e-navigation. On the other hand, IMO has identified what they consider to be some of the key components, existing components, or building blocks. Interestingly, I don't know whether it was my error or an error on the part of IMO, but anyone see AIS in that list? In the simplest sense, then, there are shore-based and shipborne equipment, systems, and services. And you can list these. This is just a partial list. It is not an all-inclusive list because, as I've tried to explain, this is impossible to do. And for the most part, you can look down and say, well, we've spoken about some of these at this conference. Things like e-LORAN. Certainly in North America, we're not sure that e-LORAN is going to be possible because U.S. Coast Guard and Canadian Coast Guard have discontinued LORAN. Not to say it couldn't come back, but again, those are the type of things that mariners will ask. Well, is a terrestrial-based secondary backup system necessary? If so, if it's going to be LORAN, then we need to know. If not, what is it going to be? Looked at it in its simplest sense, everything can be broken down into 3s. And if you look at equipment, systems, and services, this list really, when you say GPS, Global Navigation System, but really it's a part of GNSS, which is a service. And if you ask any average mariner what GPS is, he says it's equipment. So the reality then is they're all combined. And this, in theory then, in concept, ought to be the way we view e-navigation. The distinction between equipment, systems, and services, they all have to work together in a harmonized fashion. Now there are some challenges as well as opportunities. Some of these have been spoken by other presenters. Uniform data standards and protocols. Jan-Henrik Altman from Germany will speak on this right after the break on the Universal Maritime Data Model. The process for collection, integration, and dissemination. Certainly, Commander Conseco talked about how Portugal is approaching this. But this will be a major challenge with different government agencies all trying to work in a coordinated fashion in terms of who is responsible as well as who provides. And the idea that real-time and forecast information, there's a difference. Mariners need to know what will be, not necessarily what currently is. And in the future will be other things like nowcasts, which are a continuously updated forecast. Now, these are services that shipborne users can use. But The reality is the current equipment and performance standards that are in existence, it's like a balkanized system. There are many different standards for performance standards that IMO adopted for equipment. There are IHO standards for data and display, IEC testing standards for type approval and certification. All of these will have to be revisited, reanalyzed, reconsidered in terms of whether or not they will facilitate the implementation of e-navigation. And I'd like to give two examples. And these are two examples that I developed this week just to try to pick up on some of the things that you've seen either presented in this room or in the booths on display. Let me go back real quick to see. Data versus information. They are not the same. And I would like to follow up a little bit on my colleagues, Marcus Porten and Rolf Zetterberg from Finland and Sweden, who talked specifically about application-specific messages. I'll deal a little bit with some of the display issues on those. The same is true for the difference between presentation and display and portrayal. This is AIS binary data and information. I don't have a pointer and I won't take time, but the number of bits has to do with making sure that the minimum amount of information is provided as part of the data packaging. The description is the information content. And this is the previous SN Circular 236. And as Rolf Zetterberg mentioned, what used to be 236 has now been revised as part of the work of the AIS Binary Message Correspondence Group. These are now called application-specific messages. As we say in New Hampshire, same thing, only different. But the number and the type of revised and new messages, this will be a sleeping giant. Almost anything that has been spoken about in this conference, in theory, this types of information could be provided in elegant fashion via AIS binary messages. This is data. If you were to provide this to a mariner, you could say, well, everything is there, but you cannot properly, easily interpret it. It's all there, and in fact, this is in XML format, which is both human and machine readable. But for a mariner to spend time trying to decipher this while he's navigating his vessel is unrealistic. This, on the other hand, is that same information now displayed in a more useful format. And in this case, the Tampa Bay pilots in Tampa, Florida, all they said that they needed for wind and tide and current and temperature information is alphanumerics. Just give us the text, because what we're interested in is in trends. On the other hand, there are other ways to display information. Unfortunately, the minimum keyboard display, or as some mariners call it, the Mickey Mouse keyboard display, can only display text information. And there are better ways that will be required to display binary messages and other types of navigation safety information. Interestingly, ECDIS is currently constrained. Most ships that will be required to carry ECDIS under mandatory carriage in 2012 will not have the ability to display AIS binary messages because there's no requirement to do so, there's no testing standards been developed, so it may be a few years or 5 years before this capability exists. Not quite the same for integrated navigation systems, but the early innovators of the use and display